Hello, it's Vera, the Cancer Goddess, also the founder of the nonprofit Breast Cancer Goddess, where we help women emotionally, physically, and spiritually in the face of breast cancer. Today, I'm going to bring you another digital drop of my online memoir. This is number 2 of my online memoir, and it's entitled Traumatized Genetic Stock, Part 1. The genetic soil damaged due to persecution in which I inherited the BRCA1 gene. That's a little title underneath the big title. And then after that, there's a video where I summarize the story, the piece, what I wrote. And underneath that, there's a picture of some of my great family members, one being a rabbi. And let's begin. At my patient intake at the Ayurveda hospital in Kerala, India, the doctor wanted to know my history, starting before I was even born. This is a major departure from the Western medicine tradition, where you're lucky if you get 20 minutes. I got 2 hours. In 2019, when I was 39, still nursing my baby Amavita, I was diagnosed with bilateral breast cancer. I was known to be the healthiest in my family, abstaining from processed flour, sugar, alcohol, and anything mood-altering for, at that time, almost 15 years. Via a 12-step program for food addiction, through recovery in this 12-step program, I had already dealt with some deep, dark trauma. I became a yoga teacher who meditated daily. I mean, come on. How am I the only one in my family that was diagnosed with this cancer so young? It took everyone by surprise, especially me. To the Western doctors, it was too suspicious given my age, state of health, and that it was bilateral, which means on both breasts. The doctor ordered me to have genetic testing. This was all new to me, so I was just going along with the flow. I soon learned that only 5 to 10% of cancers are hereditary. Breast cancers, that is. Might I be part of that small percentage? Maybe. When I was initially diagnosed with breast cancer, it was a flood of emotions and blame. Blaming myself for getting cancer, blaming the environment, the toxicity of the food, toxicity of cleaning products. You can make yourself crazy trying to understand why. I now know that there are a myriad of factors whereby one can be diagnosed. Genetics being only a fraction. Most are environmental, as well as mental, physical, and spiritual. More on that to come, and that's what we address in our nonprofit. Upon taking the genetic test, I had never before checked a box in a standardized form for being an Ashkenazi Jew, in addition to the popularized Native American, Caucasian, Asian, and African American boxes. But Ashkenazi Jew? Well, that was a first. I checked it because I am half Ashkenazi through my mother's side and half Sephardic through my father's side. But I didn't fully connect to my Ashkenazi heritage because the cancer in my family was primarily on my father's Sephardic side. So let me simply explain for those who don't know the difference between the two Jewish factions. And then I put a picture of the checkbox, Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry. Ashkenazi Jews account for 70% of the Jews worldwide and are descendants of the Jewish people who settled in and around the Rhine Valley in what is today known as Germany and France, only about 1100 years ago. Quote, Jewish migration was motivated by the economic opportunities and often at the invitation of local Christian rulers who perceived the Jews as having the know-how and capacity to jumpstart the economy, improve revenue, and enlarge trade. This area that they migrated to had profound effect on Jewish culture, whereby the schools had major influences on the development of Jewish scholarship, culture, and law, producing some of the most important Ashkenazi Jewish scholars. They primarily spoke Yiddish, which was a blend of Hebrew, Aramaic, German, and Slavic languages. They ate traditional, quote, Jewish foods like cholent, which is a blend of potatoes and beans and whatever was available in the shtetl at the time, root vegetables, brisket, chicken liver, and heavy root vegetables. Sephardic Jews, on the other hand, date their settling to the Iberian Peninsula way back, migrating after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE. They are comprised mainly from the descendants of the 1492 Spanish Inquisition and exile, as well as those from historically Muslim lands. They primarily spoke Ladino, which is a blend of Hebrew and Spanish with a sprinkle of words from other regions Jews settled in, such as Greece, Turkey, and Arabia. Their traditional foods are more Latin and Iberian in its flavor and consisted of foods like borecas, which are savory pastries, eggplant-based dishes, medias, which are halved vegetable filled with meat or cheese and cooked in tomato sauce, and stuffed vegetables. And then I put a picture of Sephardic food because it's so beautiful. Like the Ashkenazi, the other Jews composing of the Jewish diaspora, Sephardic Jews cook foods that were popular in the countries of residence, adapting them to Jewish religious dietary restrictions. All right, I'm not gonna talk about the food anymore. But food was so much a part of my culture. I remember my dear Aunt Stephanie. She was raised Ashkenazi. She fell in love with my father's brother, Uncle Jack, a deeply devoted Sephardic who never ceased to amaze me by his collection of Cuban music, because they eventually went to Cuba. My Aunt Stephanie, in conjunction with cooking traditional Ashkenazi foods for the major Jewish holidays, would also cook in the Sephardic tradition with recipes passed down from generations. This is one of my most memorable exposures to this rich heritage and culture through food. Not a shock. Throughout history, additional distinctions between Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews evolved, especially regarding language. My father's family spoke Ladino back in the Old Land, originally Spain and Izmir, Turkey. When they immigrated to Cuba, then Miami, they dropped the Ladino and primarily spoke Spanish. Much like Yiddish, Ladino is an ancient dying language. Although I have a cousin who is a Ladino aficionado and an amazing teacher. And I want to give her a shout out for anyone curious about this ancient language. Her name is Rachel Bortnick, and I have referenced her in the post. Back to the Ashkenazi checkbox on the genetic testing form for bilateral breast cancer. I didn't identify completely as Ashkenazi since I was also Sephardic, and all the immediate cancers in my family occurred on my father's side, not my mother's side. With my father, Henry, dying of pancreatic cancer and my grandmother, Matilda, of breast cancer. I never met Matilda, but I hear she was a real fabulous woman. Well, let's learn more about the Sephardim, shall we? After the Arab invasion of the Iberian Peninsula in 711, which 711 took its name from, issued a new era in the history of Europe. For more than 800 years until 1492, Portugal and Spain were the locations of profound learning and collaboration between the Muslims and the Jews. Due to Spain's colonization of the Americas, immense wealth was brought back to the Spain in the form of silver and gold. Thus, literature, art, and culture flourished. For example, the great Jewish scholar Maimonides, born in Cordova in 1135 CE, emerged from this period. The initial conquistadores would rape, pillage, and convert the, quote, uncivilized natives in the name of Catholicism, and they became famous and drunk with wealth. As a result, many followed their path of religious fervor, using religion as a way to sublimate Jewish and Muslim populations of the Spanish, Portugal, and other colonies, eventually leading to the Crusades, a time of immense persecution and little records. Entire communities would be brutally wiped out, massacred just for being Jewish. The relatively safe time of the golden age for Jews and Muslims came to an end in 1492 when King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella issued an edict that exiled all Jews and Muslims, known as the Spanish Inquisition, not just in Spain and Portugal, but in all their colonies. Some say it started earlier in the 12th century and the Golden Age was already losing its luster, but the official edict to get the heck out, die, or convert was officially set in 1492. It's never been overtly popular to be a Jew, clearly. Starting with Abraham, the, quote, father of the Jewish people, the revolutionary concept of one God and one God only was controversial even then. Judaism was the first monotheistic religion, a term coined only in the 17th century. Before monotheism, which is now the foundation of the three main world religions, Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, humans were mainly polytheistic in that they believed in many gods. You can still see that today in the Hindu tradition and the many gods and goddesses, which I find endlessly fascinating. I did study this in college and went to India for my first time abroad. More on that to come. FYI, I also talked about this concept of monotheism and polytheism extensively in the post previous to this one, explaining my rationale for naming the nonprofit Breast Cancer Goddess. So the Jews throughout history have been largely unpopular and kicked out of many places, which is why my family went to Spain in the first place. After the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem in 70 CE, the Muslim rulers of Spain and Iberian Peninsula welcomed the Jews with proverbial open arms, opposed to other regions. The bottom line to all this is that Jews had to stick together. Like the Billie Eilish song, "Birds of a feather, we stick together," because to marry a Jew would have meant death. And after the destruction of the Second Temple, plenty of Roman men raped Jews, yet never dared marry one, which is why one of the reasons I was told that Jewish heritage is passed down through the matrilineal line, the mother's line, not the patrilineal, so that Roman rapers would then have Jewish children. So take that, you Roman rapers, your offspring became Jewish. Which is why you'll find blue-eyed, blonde-haired Jews in Europe and elsewhere, even though Jews are originally Semitic people, initially resembling Middle Eastern folks in the region. In most every place the Jews went, the women were vulnerable to rape, as there was little protection from the rulers of those provinces. Due to their constant immigration status, because they were forever being targeted and killed, they were considered beneath the populations in those territories. So rape and killing were common, unfortunately. In the terms of psychology, how do we explain this? How do we explain this human behavior and the biological underpinnings of these persecutions? I reference one of my favorite teachers ever, evolutionary psychologist Dr. Sheldon Solomon of Skidmore College. His teaching style and research influenced my journey immensely. He will be referenced a lot in my memoir. With his colleagues, they developed the burgeoning field of terror management theory, whereby the fear of death as a result of the human consciousness of their own death leads to a certain type of behavior. Sometimes this is benevolent behavior, but also not sometimes, as we are the only animal that knows about its own demise. Acknowledgement of this complicated understanding produces an anxiety that drives people to adopt worldviews that protect their self-esteem, worthiness, and sustainability, and allow them to believe that they play an important role in a meaningful world. Some of these views lead to a troubling action or troubling actions. This can be seen in prejudice, subjugation, demoralization, rape, pillage, and annihilation of the Jewish population throughout history. In addition to the annihilation and subjugation of the Jews, it was also strictly forbidden to marry Jews. Thus, Jews had to marry and copulate with each other, usually in small, isolated communities. This is genetic suicide, especially for a dwindling population which occurred after the Crusades. There was a major genetic bottleneck whereby the Jewish population was nearly wiped out. In fact, research now reveals that Ashkenazi Jews descended from around 350 people after the genetic bottleneck. What? The bottleneck dates back to only 600 to 800 years ago, now proving that Ashkenazi Jews are now our 30th cousins, are all 30th cousins. They're all 30th cousins. This fascinated and perplexed me. I wanted to understand why Ashkenazi was a checkbox, but Sephardic wasn't. Not mentioned at all, even though all the acute cancer was on my Sephardic side. This conundrum occupied my mind, and I became obsessed with trying to figure it out like a puzzle. This research was welcomed because after my double mastectomy, the first of numerous surgeries to come, I was confined to a bed for a week or so there's not much you can do. The key to a robust immune system and lack of disease is genetic diversity. Take a look at Brazilian culture. The Portuguese had no problem mating, mainly by raping an indigenous population and slaves. Hence, a very robust and largely genetically cancer-free culture emerged. Not the same for the Jews. Now, especially among the Ashkenazi population, if an Ashkenazi Jew wants to have children with an Ashkenazi Jewish woman, genetic testing is recommended to occur beforehand. Otherwise, they are at serious risk of having children with major issues, especially mental and physical. What I learned in research about my heritage is that it didn't matter if I didn't consider myself fully Ashkenazi or not. Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews come from the same genetic persecuted stock, except one faction fled to the Iberian Peninsula for a better life, and the other the lands now known as Europe. In fact, research now reveals that medieval Ashkenazi Jews were a genetic mixture of European and Middle Eastern heritage, dating far back to the Ice Age. Hence, today's Ashkenazi population still retains genetic similarities to their Sephardic cousins, as they both emerged from a common source originally in the Middle East. But why? Why was there a genetic bottleneck among the Ashkenazi population? This also perplexed me. I soon learned that there were no definitive answers, but there are major speculations. The most convincing one being from an amateur geneticist, Jim Stone. According to Stone, the bottleneck occurred because of constant persecution and destruction of the Jewish communities, especially during the Crusades. And then I post a video below of Jim Stone talking about this Ashkenazi puzzle bottleneck situation. And I say the video below blew my mind. I probably watched it more than 20 times in the hospital. When nurses would check on me, I would tell them that all that I was learning about my genetics, and some seemed genuinely interested in learning more. An article I recently found when working on this piece here confirms that Stone's historical theory in depth. Confirms his theory in depth. Bones of medieval Jews of the 12th and 13th century found an ancient well in England that revealed murdered Jews were thrown into the well haphazardly after a massacre occurred. The archaeological findings reveal that the genetic bottleneck happened earlier than originally thought. So, in my 2-hour intake, when I told the Ayurvedic doctor that I was Jewish, I didn't have to say another word, as he knew exactly why I inherited the BRCA1 gene, aka the breast cancer gene, with a 45 to 85% chance of developing breast cancer and a 10 to 46% chance of developing ovarian cancer by the age of 70. Ashkenazi, Sephardic, tomato, we all come from the same place with immense trauma and persecution imprinted on our genetic code. Many populations have faced annihilation and severe trauma, but they are no longer with us. Amazingly, Jews are still here, and we pay for that cost genetically. So stay tuned for part 2, where I will talk more extensively about my paternal and maternal grandparents' journey to America. And just a reminder, paid subscribers will receive additional resources and videos, as well as they help fund my nonprofit, especially since I don't have the 501(c) status yet, as we need to wait for it. So please help me do this. Thank you so much. And after that, I show a picture of my family in Odessa, Russia. And after that, I provide all the references for this information. So thank you.